The needle slipped into my port with a familiar pinch, and I watched the clear liquid begin its slow journey into my bloodstream. Round 14 of chemotherapy. The oncology unit at Memorial Hospital was unusually quiet this Wednesday afternoon. Just the steady hum of machines and the occasional whisper of medical staff. I adjusted my position in the oversized recliner, the one that had become my second home over the past 7 months. My reflection caught in the window beside me. Pale skin, a colorful head wrap covering my bald scalp, dark circles under eyes that used to sparkle with plans for college and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Harrison, and 6 months ago, I was just another 19-year-old community college student working part-time at a local pet clinic, saving money for veterinary school. I had plans. I had dreams. I had a future that stretched out before me like an open road. Then came the lump in my neck that wouldn't go away, the worried look in Dr. Peterson's eyes during my physical, and the words that changed everything. Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 2. Treatable, they said. Curable with aggressive treatment, they promised. What they didn't tell me was how alone I'd be fighting the battle of my life. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in September. I remember because it was the same day my little brother Marcus started high school, and my parents were more concerned about whether he'd remembered his lunch money than they were about the biopsy results we were waiting for. When Dr. Peterson called with the news, I was sitting in my car outside the pet clinic, having just finished cleaning kennels and administering medications to recovering animals. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days caring for sick creatures who couldn't speak for themselves, and now I was becoming one of them. Emma, honey, I need you to come in tomorrow so we can discuss your treatment options, Dr. Peterson had said, her voice gentle but serious. And please bring your parents. This is something you shouldn't handle alone. I promised I would, hanging up the phone with trembling fingers. When I walked into our house that evening, Mom was frantically organizing Marcus's school supplies, while Dad helped him set up his new gaming system. An early birthday gift, they explained, since his 15th birthday was still 2 months away. How did the appointment go? Mom asked without looking up from the color-coded binders she was arranging. I stood in the doorway, the weight of the diagnosis sitting heavy in my chest like a stone. They found something, I said quietly. I need to go back tomorrow. Could you guys come with me? Dad glanced up from untangling controller wires. What kind of something? Like a cyst or something simple? The hope in his voice made my heart ache. I don't know yet. That's why we need to go back. Mom finally looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the flash of fear cross her face before she quickly masked it. Of course, sweetheart. We'll figure it out. But the next day, Marcus had forgotten his chemistry textbook and needed them to bring it to school during their lunch break. It's his first week, Emma, Mom explained as she grabbed her keys. You know how important first impressions are. Dr. Peterson will understand if we reschedule, right? I sat in that sterile office alone, listening to words like chemotherapy, radiation, treatment protocols, and survival statistics while staring at the empty chairs where my parents should have been sitting. Dr. Peterson kept glancing at the door, clearly uncomfortable delivering life-altering news to a teenager with no support system present. The first few treatment sessions, they made an effort. Mom would drop me off in the morning with a thermos of soup and a magazine, promising to pick me up when the session ended. Dad would text throughout the day asking how I was feeling. Marcus even made me a get-well card with stick figures of our family surrounding a hospital bed. But as the treatments stretched from weeks into months, their attention began to drift. The novelty of having a sick daughter wore off, replaced by the more immediate demands of Marcus's increasingly busy social life. October brought Marcus's homecoming dance, and suddenly the house was buzzing with activity. Shopping for the perfect outfit, making dinner reservations, coordinating with his date's family, renting a tuxedo. I spent that week receiving my most intensive round of chemotherapy yet, the kind that left me so weak I could barely lift my head from the pillow. While I was throwing up in a hospital bathroom, they were at the tuxedo shop debating bow tie colors. While I was sleeping off the exhaustion that felt like drowning, they were planning the perfect homecoming photo session. You understand, don't you, Em? Mom said the night before my next treatment, while pressing Marcus's shirt in the kitchen. This is such an important milestone for him. First high school dance, first real date. We want everything to be perfect. I nodded from my position on the couch, too tired to argue, too sick to fight. Of course, I whispered, though the words felt like glass in my throat. Perfect for Marcus. It was always about making things perfect for Marcus. November brought Marcus's birthday planning, and with it, a shift in my family's priorities that I couldn't ignore anymore. His 15th birthday wasn't just going to be a celebration, it was going to be an event. Mom started planning in early October, creating Pinterest boards and spreadsheets with the dedication of a wedding planner. The theme was superheroes, Marcus's longtime obsession, and no expense was being spared. Custom decorations, a professional DJ, catered food, and invitations that looked like comic book covers. She spent hours on the phone with vendors, comparing prices for bounce houses, and discussing whether to hire someone to dress up as Spider-Man or Captain America. Meanwhile, my treatment schedule intensified. Doctor. Peterson had switched me to a more aggressive protocol after my last scans showed the cancer was being stubborn. We need to hit this harder, Emma, she explained during an appointment I attended alone, as usual. The next phase involves longer sessions, more frequent treatments, and closer monitoring. You'll need someone with you for the 8-hour infusions. 8 hours. The longest I'd ever spent connected to an IV, pumping chemicals into my body that would hopefully save my life while making me feel like I was dying. No problem, I told Dr. Peterson, though my stomach was already knotting with anxiety. My family will be there, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. How could they sit with me for 8 hours when Marcus's birthday party was 3 weeks away, and there were still decorations to order, a guest list to finalize, and a venue to inspect? The first 8-hour session fell on a Thursday in late November. I arrived at the hospital at 7 in the morning, armed with my phone charger, a book I was too tired to read, and a text from Mom that said, "Sorry we can't be there today. Marcus has a school thing and then we need to meet with the party planner. You're so strong, you've got this." The infusion room was full of other patients, most with family members beside them, holding hands, sharing snacks, playing cards to pass the time. I sat in my recliner, watching the bag of chemotherapy drugs slowly drip into my port, counting the hours until I could go home. By hour 4, I was nauseated and dizzy. By hour 6, I was barely conscious, my body's way of protecting itself from the assault of powerful medications. The nurses checked on me regularly, their faces kind but professional. "Your family coming later?" asked Janet, my favorite nurse, the one who always remembered how I liked my blankets arranged. "They're busy today," I replied, the same answer I'd given dozens of times over the past few months. She squeezed my hand gently, and I saw something in her eyes that looked like pity mixed with anger. When the session finally ended at 3, in the afternoon, I was too weak to stand. Janet had to wheelchair me to the curb while we waited for my Uber. "Emma," she said carefully, "you know we have support services here, right? Social workers, patient advocates, people who can help. Coordinate care when families are unavailable." I nodded weakly, but something inside me rebelled against the idea. They weren't unavailable. They were just prioritizing Marcus's birthday party over my fight for life. The Uber driver, a kind woman named Rosa, helped me into the house and onto the couch. The living room was covered with party planning materials, fabric samples, menu options, a poster board with seating arrangements. Mom looked up from her laptop where she was apparently designing custom thank you cards. "How was treatment, honey?" she asked, already turning back to the screen. "Fine," I whispered, pulling a blanket over my shaking body. "Just tired." She nodded absently, clicking through font options. "That's good, sweetie. Oh, and tomorrow. We need to stay out of the kitchen. The caterer is coming to do a tasting for Marcus's party." That night, I lay in bed listening to them discuss party details through the thin walls. Should they rent tables or use the ones the venue provided? Would a chocolate fountain be too messy? How many kids should they invite to make Marcus feel popular but not overwhelm the space? Their voices carried the excitement and energy that used to be reserved for family vacations or major holidays. Now, it was all focused on one day, one child, one birthday party that was taking on the proportions of a royal wedding. The next morning, I woke up to find Mom on the phone with someone about balloon arrangements. "We want it to look magical," she was saying, pacing around the kitchen while I tried to keep down a piece of toast. "Money isn't an object. This is our son's 15th birthday. Money isn't an object." I thought about the medical bills piling up on Dad's desk, the insurance claims we were fighting, the copays that were draining our savings account. But for Marcus's party, money wasn't an object. My second 8-hour infusion was scheduled for the following Tuesday, just 10 days before Marcus's birthday. I mentioned it at dinner the night before, hoping maybe this time someone would offer to come with me. "That's the day we're setting up decorations," Mom said, not looking up from her phone where she was apparently messaging other parents about carpools to the party. "We'll be at the venue all day making sure everything is perfect." Dad nodded. In agreement. "Sorry, Em. This party is really important to Marcus. All his friends will be there and we want him to feel special." Special. Marcus needed to feel special. What about me? What about making the girl fighting cancer feel special? But I swallowed the words, nodded understanding, and spent another 8 hours alone in that infusion chair, watching other families laugh and talk and support each other while I counted ceiling tiles and tried not to vomit. The party planning reached fever pitch in the final week. Professional decorators came to transform our backyard into a superhero headquarters. A catering truck delivered enough food to feed a small army. Marcus's custom costume arrived, a personalized superhero outfit that probably cost more than my monthly medication copays. The house buzzed with activity and excitement, and for the first time in months, I felt truly invisible in my own home. 2 days before the party, I had my worst reaction, yet to the chemotherapy. I spent the entire night vomiting, my body rejecting everything including water. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By morning, I was so dehydrated that I could barely speak. Mom found me on the bathroom floor around dawn, curled up beside the toilet, my head wrap soaked with sweat. "Oh, honey," she said, kneeling beside me. "You look terrible. Maybe you should call the doctor." "Can you take me to the hospital?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I think something's wrong." She glanced at her watch, then at her phone, which was buzzing with what I assumed were party-related messages. "Today's really bad timing, Em. The final decorations are being delivered, and I need to coordinate everything. Can you call an ambulance? Or maybe that Uber driver who's been helping you?" An ambulance. She wanted me to call an ambulance rather than miss a decoration delivery. I ended up calling Janet, my nurse from the hospital, who wasn't supposed to make house calls but came anyway when she heard how I sounded on the phone. She took one look at me and insisted on driving me to the emergency room herself. "This isn't normal treatment reaction," she muttered as she helped me to her car. "You're severely dehydrated and probably malnourished. How long has it been since anyone checked on your eating and hydration at home?" I couldn't answer because the truth was too humiliating. No one had been checking on anything about me at home. The emergency room doctor was concerned enough to admit me overnight for IV fluids and monitoring. I spent Marcus's birthday eve in a hospital bed, alone, while my family put the finishing touches on what would be the party of the year. Janet stayed past her shift to sit with me, bringing crossword puzzles and terrible hospital coffee. "Emma," she said gently as I sipped broth through a straw, "this isn't sustainable. You need support at home. You need people who prioritize your health and recovery." "They love me," I said weakly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke. "Them. They're just busy. Marcus's birthday is really important to them." Janet set down her coffee and looked at me with the kind of direct gaze that cuts through all pretense. "Sweetheart, you're fighting cancer. There isn't anything more important than that. Nothing." The next day was Marcus's birthday, and I was discharged just in time to witness the spectacle from my bedroom window. Cars lined our street as parents dropped off excited teenagers in costumes. The backyard had been transformed into something out of a movie, with professional lighting, a DJ booth, and decorations that must have cost thousands of dollars. I watched from behind my curtain as Marcus made his grand entrance, wearing his custom superhero costume and grinning like he'd just saved the world. The party was everything they'd planned and more. I could hear the music, the laughter, the DJ announcing games and contests. At one point, they brought out a cake that was so elaborate it required its own table. Marcus blew out the candles while everyone sang, and I found myself crying, not from sadness, but from the stark realization of how different our priorities had become. On his birthday, Marcus was surrounded by dozens of people celebrating his existence. On my treatment days, I sat alone in a chair fighting for my life. Around 8 o'clock, Mom briefly came upstairs to check on me. She was glowing with the success of the party, her cheeks flushed with excitement and pride. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, though she was already glancing back toward the door where party sounds were calling her back. "The party looks amazing," I said instead of answering her question. "Marcus seems really happy." She beamed. "It's perfect, isn't it? We wanted to give him something special, something he'll remember forever." Something he'll remember forever. I wondered what I would remember forever about being 19 and fighting cancer. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the family had collapsed from exhaustion and excitement, I made a decision. I couldn't keep pretending that this was normal, that this was okay, that this was what love looked like. Sitting in my bed, surrounded by the distant sounds of cleanup and Marcus recounting his favorite party moments, I realized that I had been fighting two battles, one against cancer and one for my family's attention and care. And I was losing both. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I called the hospital's social services department and left a message for Linda Rodriguez, the patient advocate who had given me her card during my first week of treatment. "Hi, this is Emma Harrison," I said into the voicemail system, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I think I need help, not with my cancer treatment. That part I can handle. I need help figuring out how to do this alone, because I think that's what I'm going to have to do." The next morning, Linda called me back while my family was still sleeping off the party excitement. We talked for over an hour about resources, support systems, and what options were available for young adult cancer patients who didn't have adequate family support. "Emma," she said near the end of our conversation, "you shouldn't have to fight cancer alone. That's not how this is supposed to work." I knew she was right, but knowing and accepting are two different things. That conversation was the beginning of everything changing, though I didn't know it yet. All I knew was that I was tired of being invisible in my own medical crisis, tired of pretending that Marcus's social life was more important than my survival, and tired of making excuses for people who should have been making excuses to be with me. The party was over, but my real fight was just beginning. Linda Rodriguez turned out to be exactly what I needed, someone who listened without judgment and acted without hesitation. When we met in person 3 days after Marcus's birthday extravaganza, she sat across from me in the hospital's family consultation room with a thick folder and the kind of focused attention I hadn't received from my own family in months. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had clearly seen too many situations like mine. "Emma, I've reviewed your file and spoken with your medical team," she began, spreading documents across the small table between us. "Your treatment compliance has been excellent. Your attitude toward recovery is outstanding, but your support system is essentially non-existent. That's not sustainable for someone undergoing the intensive protocol you're on." She paused, studying my face. "Tell me about yesterday. Walk me through what happened when you needed emergency care." I found myself telling her everything. Not just about the dehydration episode, but about months of sitting alone during treatments, missing appointments because no one could drive me, and spending recovery days isolated while my family planned elaborate celebrations for Marcus. Linda took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, never once suggesting that I was exaggerating or being unfair to my parents. "The morning I called 911, I continued, surprised by how good it felt to finally tell someone the complete truth. Mom was coordinating the balloon arch delivery. When the paramedics arrived, she was more worried about the neighbors seeing the ambulance than she was about why I needed one." Linda's pen stopped moving across her notepad. "She didn't come with you to the hospital?" I shook my head. "She said she couldn't leave because the decorators needed supervision. She promised to come later, after everything was set up properly." "And did she come later?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "She texted around 6 asking how I was doing. When I told her the doctor wanted to keep me overnight for observation, she said that was probably for the best, since the house would be chaotic with final party preparations anyway." Saying it out loud made it sound even worse than it had felt. In the moment, Linda closed her notepad and leaned back in her chair. "Emma, what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but it's important. Medical neglect of a dependent adult is a serious issue, especially when it involves someone undergoing life-saving treatment. Your parents have a legal and moral obligation to ensure you receive proper care and support during your recovery." She paused. "What they're doing isn't just hurtful, it's potentially dangerous." The word neglect hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of it as misplaced priorities, poor timing, or simple thoughtlessness. But neglect was something different, something that implied intention and pattern rather than oversight. "I don't want to cause trouble for them," I said quietly. "They're not bad people. They're just really focused on Marcus right now." "Emma," Linda said gently, "when someone is fighting cancer, there shouldn't be anything more important than their health and recovery. The fact that you're even having to compete for your parents' attention during the most challenging experience of your life is deeply concerning." She opened another folder. "I want to show you some options. You're 19, which means you have more autonomy than younger patients, but you still need and deserve support." Over the next hour, Linda outlined resources I didn't know existed, patient advocacy programs that could provide transportation to treatments, social workers who specialized in family dynamics during medical crises, support groups for young adults with cancer, and most importantly, something called the Independent Patient Support Program. "It's designed for adult patients who don't have adequate family support," she explained. "We can arrange for trained volunteers to accompany you to treatments, help coordinate your care, and provide the emotional support you need." "You mean, like having someone there during the 8-hour sessions?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it was possible. "Exactly like that. These volunteers are specially trained to support cancer patients. They're not medical professionals, but they understand what you're going through and they're committed to being there consistently." The relief I felt was overwhelming. To not sit alone for 8 hours, to have someone who actually cared about my comfort and well-being, to matter to someone during the hardest moments of my treatment. But even as hope bloomed in my chest, guilt followed close behind. Won't my parents think I'm rejecting them? Like I'm saying they're not good enough? Linda studied my face carefully. Emma, you've been receiving inadequate support for months? You've been to the emergency room alone, attended treatments alone, and recovered alone. At what point do you prioritize your own health and survival over their feelings? That afternoon, Linda introduced me to Margaret Chen, a volunteer with the Independent Patient Support Program, who would become my advocate and companion through the remaining months of treatment. Margaret was a retired teacher in her 60s who had survived breast cancer 15 years earlier. She had the kind of warm, no-nonsense personality that made you feel safe and heard from the first conversation. I've been volunteering with the program for 8 years, Margaret told me as we sat in the hospital's patient garden. I work with young adults whose families are struggling to provide adequate support during treatment. Sometimes it's because of distance, sometimes because of work obligations, and sometimes because families just don't know how to cope with a cancer diagnosis. She paused. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's because the patient isn't the priority they should be. Margaret asked detailed questions about my treatment schedule, my side effects, my transportation needs, and my emotional state. Unlike my family's cursory check-ins, her questions were specific and actionable. What time of day do you feel most nauseated? What helps with the fatigue? Do you have nutritious food readily available at home? Are you able to sleep comfortably? It was the first time in months that someone had treated my cancer experience as something worth understanding in detail. For your next 8-hour session? On Thursday, Margaret said, pulling out a small calendar. I'll be there from start to finish. I'll bring books, card games, snacks, whatever you need to stay comfortable. And afterward, I'll drive you home and make sure you're settled safely. The simplicity of her offer brought tears to my eyes. She was volunteering to do what my family should have been fighting to do. That evening, I tried to tell my parents about the support program, hoping they might be relieved to know I was getting the help I needed. I found them in the living room, surrounded by photo albums from Marcus's party, reliving every perfect moment. "That's wonderful, sweetie," Mom said when I explained about Margaret. "It'll be good for you to have someone to talk to." She was already turning back to a photo of Marcus cutting his elaborate cake. "She's going to come to my treatments with me," I continued, hoping for some kind of reaction, some acknowledgement of what this meant. Dad looked up briefly. "That's thoughtful of her. Very nice of the hospital to provide that service." He didn't seem to understand that the service existed, specifically because families weren't providing adequate support. To him, it was just a convenience, like valet parking or room service. The difference in my treatment experience with Margaret present was immediate and profound. She arrived early for my Thursday session, armed with a bag full of comfort items. Soft blankets, herbal tea, puzzle books, and a tablet loaded with movies we could watch together. When the nurse accessed my port and started the IV, Margaret held my hand and distracted me with stories about her former students. When nausea hit around hour 3, she had ginger candies ready and knew exactly how to position the bed for maximum comfort. "You're handling this remarkably well," Margaret observed as we watched the chemotherapy drip slowly into my system. "I can tell you've been doing this alone for a while. You've developed a lot of coping strategies." Her recognition of my strength felt different from my family's constant refrain that I was tough and could handle anything. Margaret saw my resilience as something admirable rather than something that excused them from providing support. During hour 6, when the medication made me drowsy and confused, Margaret simply sat quietly beside me, occasionally adjusting my blanket or offering sips of water. She didn't try to make conversation when I clearly needed rest, but I could feel her presence, steady and reassuring. When I woke up near the end of the session, she was still there, reading a book and waiting patiently for me to be ready for company again. "How do you feel?" she asked as the nurse removed my IV. "Tired, but not as awful as usual," I admitted. "I think having someone here made it easier somehow." Margaret smiled. That's what support is supposed to do. It's not supposed to make the cancer go away, but it should make the experience more bearable. On the drive home, Margaret asked about my recovery routine. What do you usually do after these long sessions? Do you have help with meals, medication schedules, comfort measures? I found myself describing the reality of my post-treatment. Days, hours alone on the couch, struggling to keep food down, no one checking on me until dinner time when someone might ask how I was feeling in passing. That stops now, Margaret said firmly as she pulled into my driveway. I'm going to come in with you, make sure you're settled comfortably, prepare some easy snacks you can reach, and set up everything you'll need for the next few hours. Then, I'll check on you tomorrow morning. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plan, the kind of detailed care strategy my family had never developed. Inside the house, Margaret moved efficiently through tasks I hadn't even realized I needed help with. She set up a comfortable nest on the couch with extra pillows, filled water bottles and placed them within reach, prepared a selection of bland snacks that would be easy on my stomach, and organized my medications with clear timing instructions. When my parents came home from Marcus's soccer practice, they found Margaret helping me into comfortable clothes and setting up a humidifier to help with the dry mouth that was a side effect of treatment. "Oh, you must be the volunteer Emma mentioned," Mom said, though she seemed more curious than grateful. "That's so nice of you to help out." Margaret's smile was polite but cool. It's important for patients to have consistent support during intensive treatment. Emma is doing beautifully, but these sessions are taxing and recovery requires proper care. There was something in Margaret's tone that suggested she understood exactly what had been happening in this house, and she wasn't impressed. Dad, apparently, oblivious to the subtle criticism, launched into a description of Marcus's soccer game, including detailed commentary on every goal and save. Margaret listened politely for a few minutes before excusing herself, but not before confirming our plans for the next treatment session. After Margaret left, the house felt different somehow. Having someone witness my actual needs and provide immediate practical support highlighted how inadequate my family's care had been. When Mom asked how the treatment went, I found myself giving her specific details instead of my usual fine response. The nausea was pretty bad around hour 3, but Margaret had ginger candies that helped. She stayed the whole time and drove me home afterward. She's coming back tomorrow morning to check on how I'm doing. That's really thorough of her, Mom said, though there was something in her voice I couldn't quite identify. It seems like a lot of time and effort for a volunteer. I studied her face, wondering if she was beginning to understand that Margaret was providing the level of care that family members typically offered. She said it's important for patients to have consistent support during intensive treatment. I repeated Margaret's words. Mom nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm glad someone can be there with you. We've just been so busy with Marcus's schedule, and you always seem to handle everything so well on your own. There it was again. The assumption that my capability meant I didn't need or deserve support, rather than recognition that I'd been forced to develop independence because support wasn't available. That night, Marcus knocked on my bedroom door, something he rarely did anymore. "Hey, Em, can I come in?" He looked younger than his 15 years, almost shy. "I wanted to ask you something." I patted the bed beside me, and he sat down carefully, as if I might break. "Are you really sick? Like, actually sick? The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Marcus fidgeted with the corner of my blanket. "I mean, I know you have cancer and you go to treatments and stuff, but you never really look sick, you know? You're always just tired or whatever. But today that lady was here helping you, and she seemed really serious about it. Like it was a big deal." I realized that my efforts to minimize my illness around the family, to avoid being a burden or creating worry, had actually convinced my little brother that cancer was no more serious than a cold. "Yeah, Marcus, I'm really sick. The treatments are really hard and the cancer is serious. I've been trying not to worry you guys, but it's actually a pretty big deal." His eyes widened. Is that why you've been so quiet lately? And why you sleep so much? I nodded. The medicine that's supposed to make me better also makes me feel terrible. That's why I need help getting to treatments and why I'm tired all the time. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I didn't know. Mom and Dad always said you were handling it really well and didn't need us to worry about it. I am handling it well, I said carefully, but that doesn't mean I don't need support. Margaret helps because it's hard to go through this alone. Marcus looked genuinely confused. But you're not alone. We're here. His innocent assumption that physical presence in the same house equaled emotional and practical support made my heart ache. Being here and being available are different things, I said gently. When I'm at treatments for 8 hours, I'm alone. When I'm recovering and feeling sick, I'm alone. When I need someone to drive me to appointments, I have to find other ways to get there. I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile it with what our parents had told him about my situation. Why don't Mom and Dad come with you? He asked, the question simple and devastating. They're usually busy with other things. Your school stuff, your activities, your friends. They think I can handle it on my own. Marcus frowned. But my stuff isn't more important than you being sick, is it? Out of the mouths of babes. My 15-year-old brother had grasped something our parents seemed incapable of understanding. It shouldn't be, I said quietly. But sometimes it feels like it is. Marcus sat with that for a while, and I could almost see him recalculating months of family dynamics through this new lens. I'm sorry, he said finally. I didn't know you needed help. I thought you were okay because everyone said you were okay. I hugged him then. This little brother who had been as much a victim of our parents' misplaced priorities as I had been. It's not your fault, Marcus. You didn't know because no one explained it to you. After he left my room, I lay awake thinking about perspective and truth-telling. My family had created a narrative where my independence was a virtue rather than a necessity, where my strength excused their absence rather than highlighting their failure to provide support. Margaret's presence had disrupted that narrative, making it impossible to ignore the gap between what I needed and what I was receiving. The next morning, Margaret arrived as promised, bringing fresh fruit and homemade soup. She checked my temperature, assessed my hydration level, and sat with me while I managed to eat a small breakfast. "How was your night?" she asked, the kind of specific question that required a real answer rather than a polite deflection. "Rough until about 3 a.m., then I slept pretty well," I told her honestly. The anti-nausea medication helped, but I still couldn't keep much down. Margaret made notes in a small journal she carried. "That's normal for where you are in the treatment cycle. We'll make sure to have bland options ready for your next session, and I'll talk to the nursing staff about adjusting your pre-medication routine." It struck me that Margaret was treating my cancer care like a collaborative project rather than something I should handle independently. She was building a knowledge base about my specific needs and responses, creating strategies for better outcomes, and involving the medical team in optimizing my experience. It was the kind of advocacy and attention to detail that I'd assumed was beyond what anyone could reasonably expect, but which Margaret provided as a matter of course. When my parents came downstairs for breakfast, they seemed surprised to find Margaret still there. "I thought the volunteer thing was just for treatment days," Dad said, though he was polite enough. Margaret's smile was professional. "Recovery support is just as important as treatment support. The 48 hours following intensive chemotherapy are critical for preventing complications and ensuring proper healing." Mom poured herself coffee, glancing between Margaret and me. "Emma's always been really good at taking care of herself. Very independent, very mature." I wanted to scream. My independence wasn't a character trait. It was a survival mechanism I'd developed because adequate care wasn't available. Margaret seemed to understand this without me having to explain it. "Independence is valuable," Margaret said carefully. But serious illness requires interdependence. Even the most capable patients need consistent support during treatment and recovery. She was diplomatic enough not to directly criticize my parents, but her message was clear. What I'd been receiving wasn't adequate, and what she was providing was what should have been normal. After Margaret left that afternoon, having ensured I was stable and comfortable, Mom approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Emma, honey, do you feel like we haven't been supportive enough? Because that volunteer seems to think you need more help than we realized." Her tone was defensive, but there was also genuine confusion, as if she truly couldn't see what had been obvious to everyone else. "I do need more help," I said simply. "The treatments are really hard, and recovering alone is scary sometimes. Margaret provides the kind of support that makes it manageable." I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound accusatory. "I've been trying not to be a burden, but I think that made it seem like I didn't need anyone." Mom sat down beside me, looking troubled. "We never wanted you to feel like a burden. We just thought you were doing so well, handling everything so maturely. You never asked for help." The familiar refrain that put the responsibility on me for requesting support rather than on them for offering it. "I shouldn't have to ask for help when I'm fighting cancer," I said quietly. "That should be automatic." We sat in silence for a while, and I could see her struggling with the implications of what I'd said. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe we haven't been paying enough attention. We've been so focused on keeping Marcus's life normal, making sure he doesn't feel scared or disrupted by your illness. We thought that was the right thing to do." "Marcus came to talk to me last night," I told her. "He didn't even realize how serious my illness was, because everyone kept telling him I was handling it fine and he didn't need to worry. But he wanted to know why I needed a volunteer when I had family. He couldn't understand why you and Dad weren't coming to treatments with me." The question that had seemed simple to my teenage brother, why weren't my parents providing the support that volunteers had to be brought in to offer, hung in the air between us. Mom looked genuinely shaken, as if she was seeing our family dynamic from an outside perspective for the first time. "We thought we were protecting him," she said slowly. "And we thought you were so strong, so capable of handling it." I nodded. "I am strong, and I am capable. But that doesn't mean I should have to handle cancer alone. It doesn't mean I don't deserve the same attention and care you'd give Marcus if he was sick." That evening, I overheard my parents talking in their bedroom, voices low but urgent. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was serious, concerned, the kind of conversation that suggested they were finally grappling with realities they'd been avoiding. The next morning, Dad knocked on my door before leaving for work. "Emma, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about needing more support." He looked uncomfortable, but determined. "I want to come to your next treatment. Would that be okay?" The offer was tentative, almost shy, as if he wasn't sure he'd be welcome in a space where Margaret had been providing the care he should have been offering all along. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it despite everything. "Margaret will still be there. She's already planned to come, but it would mean a lot to have you there too." Dad nodded, looking relieved. "Good. That's good. I should have been there, from the beginning." It was a start, though I wondered if it was too little, too late. The damage of months of medical neglect couldn't be undone with a single gesture, but perhaps it was the beginning of my family finally understanding what support during serious illness was supposed to look like. Margaret had shown them, simply by providing it consistently and competently, exactly what I'd been missing all along. Dad's first treatment session with me was awkward in ways I hadn't anticipated. He arrived at Memorial Hospital 15 minutes early, dressed in his best khakis and a button-down shirt as if he were attending a business meeting rather than sitting through 8 hours of chemotherapy. Margaret was already there, setting up our usual comfort station with blankets, snacks, and entertainment options. She greeted Dad politely, but I could sense her reservations about this sudden involvement after months of absence. "So this is where it all happens," Dad said, looking around the infusion center with the uncomfortable fascination of someone seeing their daughter's reality for the first time. The unit was busy that morning, filled with patients of all ages connected to IV poles, some sleeping, others chatting quietly with family members or reading. "It's bigger than I expected," he continued, as if the size of the room somehow related to the seriousness of what happened there. When Nurse Janet came over to access my port and start the IV, Dad watched with barely concealed horror as the needle went into the device under my skin. "Does that hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not really," I replied, though I appreciated that he'd thought to ask. It was the first time anyone in my family had shown interest in the physical details of my treatment experience. "The port makes it easier than regular IVs. I've had this one for 6 months now." 6 months. I could see him processing that information, realizing how long this had been going on, how many sessions he'd missed. Margaret settled into her usual chair on my right side while Dad took the seat on my left, clearly unsure of what his role should be in this well-established routine. "Do you usually do anything special during these sessions?" he asked, looking to Margaret for guidance. "Emma and I have developed some strategies over the past few weeks," Margaret replied diplomatically. "We've learned when she tends to get nauseated, what positions are most comfortable, what helps pass the time during the longer stretches." Her emphasis on the timeline was gentle but pointed. She'd been here for weeks learning these details while he was experiencing them for the first time. The first few hours went smoothly enough. Dad asked careful questions about the medications, the timeline, the side effects I'd typically experienced. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding what I'd been going through, though his attention was clearly divided between concern for me and amazement at the complexity of the treatment process. Around hour 3, when the pre-medications began wearing off and nausea started building, Margaret smoothly shifted into caregiver mode. "Here we go, Emma," she said, recognizing the signs before I'd even spoken. She adjusted my chair position, handed me the special nausea candies that had become part of our routine, and dimmed the light slightly. "Remember to breathe slowly and let me know if you need the basin." Dad watched this choreographed response with something like awe, clearly realizing how much expertise went into managing my comfort during these sessions. "How did you know she was feeling sick?" he asked Margaret quietly. "Practice," she replied simply. "After several sessions together, you learn to read the subtle signs. Everyone's pattern is a little different." Dad looked at me with new understanding, as if seeing for the first time that my cancer treatment involved far more than just showing up and sitting in a chair for a few hours. By hour 5, I was in the difficult phase where consciousness became optional and my body focused entirely on processing the powerful medications. Dad kept asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, clearly distressed by seeing me so vulnerable and unresponsive. Margaret gently explained that this was normal, even necessary part of the process. "Her body is working very hard right now. The best thing we can do is keep her comfortable and let the medicine do its job." "She goes through this every time?" Dad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded. "The intensity varies depending on where we are in the treatment cycle. But yes, this level of physical stress is normal for her protocol." I could hear them talking about me as if I were unconscious, which I almost was, and I was struck by how different their perspectives were. Margaret spoke about my experience with clinical knowledge and personal familiarity, while Dad spoke about it with the shock of someone encountering an unimaginable reality. When the session finally ended, and Janet began removing my IV, Dad looked emotionally drained despite having spent most of the day sitting quietly. "I had no idea," he said to Margaret as we prepared to leave. "I thought it was more like getting a shot or something quick. I didn't realize how intense this was, how long it takes, how sick it makes her." Margaret's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. 8 hours is a long time to spend alone when you're feeling this rough, she replied, gathering my things while Dad helped me into the wheelchair the hospital required for transport to the car. It makes a significant difference having support during the process. Her comment wasn't accusatory, but it clearly highlighted what had been missing from my experience for months. The drive home was quiet, with Dad glancing at me frequently in the rearview mirror, as if checking to make sure I was still breathing. When we arrived at the house, he insisted on helping Margaret get me settled on the couch, asking detailed questions about recovery protocols and what warning signs to watch for. Should I wake her up to check on her? How often should she try to eat something? What if she gets worse during the night? Margaret patiently answered his questions while setting up my usual recovery station. The key is consistency, she explained. Regular small amounts of food and liquid, monitoring for fever or unusual symptoms, and making sure she gets rest but doesn't become completely isolated. She handed him a written schedule she'd prepared. This is the routine Emma and I have developed. It helps ensure she gets proper nutrition and stays hydrated during the recovery period. Dad studied the schedule as if it were a complex technical manual, which in some ways it was. Margaret had documented not just medication timing, but optimal food choices, warning signs to monitor, comfort measures that helped with specific symptoms, and check-in intervals that balanced care with rest. It was the kind of detailed protocol that develops when someone consistently observes and responds to a patient's needs over time. "You really know what you're doing," Dad said to Margaret, and there was admiration in his voice mixed with something that might have been shame. "Where did you learn all this?" Margaret smiled gently. "Experience, training, and most importantly, spending time with Emma and paying attention to what works for her specifically. Every patient is different, so you have to develop individualized approaches." After Margaret left, Dad sat with me while I dozed fitfully on the couch. Every time I stirred or made a sound, he was immediately alert, checking if I needed anything. When Mom and Marcus came home from Marcus's guitar lesson, Dad met them at the door with a seriousness I hadn't seen from him in months. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "About Emma, about what she's been going through, about what we haven't been doing." I pretended to sleep while listening to their conversation in the kitchen, though the medication made it difficult to follow every word. Dad's voice was urgent, almost agitated, as he described the treatment session and what he'd learned about my daily reality. "She's been going through hell, and we've been acting like it's no big deal because she never complained. But she wasn't. Complaining because she thought she had to handle it alone. We always told her we were available if she needed us." Mom's voice was defensive. She never asked for help. Dad's response was sharper than I'd heard him speak to her in years. She shouldn't have had to ask. If Marcus was getting chemotherapy, would we wait for him to ask us to come with him? Would we assume he was fine just because he didn't specifically request our presence? The comparison to Marcus was powerful because it highlighted the double standard that had developed in our family. Marcus's needs were anticipated and met before he even expressed them, while my needs had to be explicitly requested and justified. The unfairness of it was stark when put in those terms, and I could hear the discomfort in Mom's silence. "That volunteer, Margaret, she knows more about Emma's treatment than we do," Dad continued. "She has detailed notes about side effects, medication responses, comfort measures. She's been doing what we should have been doing all along." His voice cracked slightly. "Emma looked so small in that chair today, so sick and tired. And she's been doing it alone for months because we were too busy planning birthday parties and soccer tournaments." Marcus's voice joined the conversation, young and confused. "Are you saying Emma's really sick? Like sicker than we thought?" There was a long pause before Dad answered. "Yes, son. Much sicker than we let ourselves believe. The treatments are really hard on her body, and she needs a lot more support than we've been giving her." But why didn't she tell us? Marcus asked, the question innocent and devastating. She did tell us, Dad replied heavily. We just weren't listening. We were so focused on keeping your life normal that we forgot Emma's life wasn't normal anymore. We forgot that having cancer at 19 isn't something anyone should have to handle independently. That night, I woke up several times to find Dad checking on me, bringing water, adjusting blankets, asking if I needed anything for nausea or pain. His attentiveness was touching, but also highlighted how alone I'd been during previous recovery periods. When Margaret called the next morning to check on how I was doing, Dad answered the phone and spent 20 minutes asking questions about long-term recovery strategies and how he could better support my ongoing treatment. Emma seems to be responding well to having family support, Margaret told me when Dad handed over the phone. It's remarkable how much difference consistent care makes in the recovery process. I could hear the diplomatic way she phrased it, acknowledging the improvement while gently emphasizing what had been missing before. Over the following days, Dad's newfound awareness of my situation created tension in the house that hadn't existed before. He started questioning family priorities. That had seemed normal just a week earlier. When Mom suggested spending Saturday at Marcus's soccer tournament 3 hours away, Dad pointed out that it was the day after my next treatment, and I might need support during recovery. When Marcus wanted the family to attend his friend's birthday party, Dad wondered aloud whether it was appropriate to prioritize social events when I was dealing with intensive medical treatment. You're making me feel guilty for having a normal teenage life, Marcus complained after Dad declined to drive him to a movie with friends because it conflicted with my treatment schedule. That's not fair. I didn't choose for Emma to have cancer. The comment hung in the air, honest and painful. Dad's response was measured but firm. You're right. None of us chose this. But cancer isn't something that only affects Emma. It affects our whole family, and that means we all have to make adjustments. Mom seemed caught between her old patterns of prioritizing Marcus's social life and Dad's new insistence on centering my medical needs. Maybe we're overcompensating, she suggested during one of their increasingly frequent discussions about family scheduling. Emma has been managing fine on her own for months. We don't want to make her feel like an invalid now. She wasn't managing fine, Dad replied, his voice tight with frustration. She was surviving despite inadequate support. There's a difference. He'd started using language that sounded like Margaret's patient advocacy training, talking about support systems and care coordination in ways that made it clear he'd been educating himself about what cancer patients actually needed. The shift in family dynamics was most apparent during my next treatment session when both Dad and Margaret came with me. Dad had prepared for the day like a military operation, bringing a cooler with specific foods Margaret had recommended, a folder with questions for the medical staff, and a detailed schedule of my usual treatment routine. He'd clearly been studying the notes Margaret had shared with him, trying to become as competent a caregiver as possible in a short amount of time. Margaret seemed pleased by his preparation, but also amused by his intensity. You don't have to become an expert overnight, she told him gently as he consulted his notes for the third time in an hour. The most important thing is being present and paying attention to Emma's cues. The technical knowledge develops over time. Dad nodded seriously, clearly committed to mastering every aspect of my care. During the treatment, I found myself in the unusual position of having two people focused entirely on my comfort and well-being. Dad asked frequent questions about what I was experiencing, how I was feeling, what he could do to help. Margaret provided guidance and reassurance, helping him understand which responses were normal and which required intervention. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, having such concentrated attention after months of going through treatment, essentially alone. This is what support is supposed to look like, I thought, as Dad held my hand during the difficult middle hours while Margaret managed the practical aspects of my care. Having two people who understood my needs, who were committed to my comfort, who treated my cancer treatment as their priority rather than an inconvenience to be managed around other obligations. When we got home, Dad continued his intensive caregiving approach, checking on me every hour, bringing meals and medications exactly on schedule, monitoring my symptoms with the dedication of a medical professional. Mom seemed bewildered by his transformation from distant observer to hands-on caregiver. "You're being awfully attentive," she commented, though her tone was more curious than critical. "I'm being what I should have been all along," Dad replied simply. Emma needed this level of care from the beginning. I just didn't understand because I wasn't paying attention. His acknowledgement of past failures was honest and painful, but it also felt like a foundation for building something better. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with the family's new priorities. His activities were now scheduled around my treatment and recovery needs, rather than the other way around. Playdates were postponed if they conflicted with medical appointments. Family outings were planned with my energy levels and immune system considerations in mind. For the first time in months, his needs weren't automatically the determining factor in family decisions. "I feel like I'm being punished for Emma being sick," he told Mom one evening, his teenage frustration boiling over. "Everything has to revolve around her treatments and recovery and whether she's feeling okay. What about what I want to do?" It was an understandable complaint from a 15-year-old who'd grown accustomed to being the center of family attention, but it also revealed how skewed our priorities had become. Mom's response surprised me. Instead of immediately reassuring Marcus that his needs mattered most, she sat down with him for a serious conversation about family responsibilities during medical crises. "When someone in the family is fighting cancer, everyone has to make sacrifices," she said gently. "Emma has been sacrificing for months by handling this mostly alone, so we could focus on your activities. Now, it's time for us to sacrifice some convenience and social activities so she can get the support she deserves." The conversation represented a fundamental shift in how our family understood fairness and priorities. For months, the assumption had been that I should manage my cancer treatment around Marcus's schedule and our parents' convenience. Now, finally, the assumption was that a life-threatening illness took precedence over social activities and routine obligations. Dr. Peterson noticed the change during my next appointment. "Emma, you seem different today," she observed as she reviewed my latest test results. "More relaxed, maybe? Less stressed?" I glanced at Dad, who had insisted on coming to this appointment to meet with my oncologist directly. "I have more support now," I told her. "My family is more involved in my care." Dr. Peterson smiled. "That makes a significant difference in treatment outcomes. Patients with strong support systems generally handle treatment better, have fewer complications, and recover more quickly." She turned to Dad. "Mr. Harrison, I'm glad you're here. Let me give you some information about what to expect as we move into the final phases of Emma's treatment protocol." As Dr. Peterson explained the remaining treatment timeline, potential side effects, and long-term recovery expectations, Dad took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions. It was clear he was approaching my cancer care with the same thoroughness he brought to his work projects, determined to understand every aspect of what I was facing. "What can we do at home to optimize her recovery?" he asked. "Are there warning signs we should watch for? How can we best support her through the more difficult phases?" "Those are exactly the right questions," Dr. Peterson replied approvingly. "Family involvement in care planning makes a tremendous difference. Emma has been remarkably resilient, handling this largely independently, but having engaged family support will make the remaining treatment much more manageable." Her emphasis on how I'd been handling treatment largely independently wasn't lost on Dad, who looked uncomfortable with the recognition of what that implied. After the appointment, Dad asked if we could stop for coffee, something we hadn't done together in years. As we sat in the small cafe near the hospital, he seemed to be gathering courage for a difficult conversation. "Emma, "I owe you an apology," he began, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "A big one. I failed you when you needed me most, and I can't excuse that by saying I didn't understand how serious this was." "Dad, you don't have to—" I started, but he held up a hand. "Yes, I do. I let you fight cancer alone because it was easier than disrupting our routine. I told myself you were handling it well because I wanted to believe that, not because it was actually true. I prioritized Marcus's birthday party over your medical crisis, and that's unforgivable." His directness was painful, but also healing. For months, I'd been making excuses for my family's behavior, telling myself they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Having Dad acknowledge the reality of what had happened validated my experience in a way that felt liberating. "I appreciate you saying that," I said quietly. "It's been really hard feeling like I didn't matter as much as other things." "You matter more than anything," Dad said firmly. "I lost sight of that, but I won't again. Margaret helped me understand what real support looks like, and I'm committed to providing that for the rest of your treatment and beyond." He paused. "I also want to make sure this doesn't happen again, with Marcus or any future health issues in our family. We need to learn how to be better at this." The idea that my cancer experience could teach our family how to handle future crises felt like finding meaning in suffering. If my struggle helped us become people who showed up for each other during difficult times, then perhaps some good could come from these months of isolation and fear. "Margaret has been amazing," I agreed. "She showed me what it feels like to have someone who's completely focused on my well-being during treatment." "I want to be that person for you too," Dad said. "I know I can't undo the past few months, but I can commit to being present and engaged for whatever comes next." His sincerity was unmistakable, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely hopeful about having family support for the remainder of my treatment. When we got home, Dad sat down with Mom and Marcus for what he called a family meeting about priorities and responsibilities. I listened from the living room as he explained what he'd learned about cancer care, family support systems, and the importance of everyone understanding their role in helping me through the remaining months of treatment. "This isn't about making anyone feel guilty," he said. "It's about recognizing that we haven't been doing enough and committing to doing better going forward. Emma deserves to have her family rallying around her, not expecting her to manage this alone while we focus on other things." His leadership in reshaping our family's approach felt like a turning point, the moment when my cancer finally became a family crisis rather than my personal burden. That night, as I prepared for bed with medications that no longer felt overwhelming, because I knew I had support managing them, I reflected on how dramatically things had changed. Margaret's consistent care had shown my family what I needed, and Dad's firsthand experience with my treatment had motivated him to become the advocate I'd needed all along. It wasn't too late to have family support for the remainder of my cancer journey, and that realization filled me with gratitude and hope for what lay ahead. The transformation in our family didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without its complications. Mom struggled with Dad's sudden insistence that everything revolve around my treatment schedule, especially when it meant disappointing Marcus or missing events they'd previously considered important. 3 weeks after Dad's awakening, we faced our first major test when Marcus's school announced he'd been selected for the regional science fair, which happened to fall on the same day as one of my most intensive treatment sessions. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been working toward," Mom argued during a heated discussion in the kitchen. "Marcus has been preparing for months, and the regional competition could lead to state finals. We can't ask him to miss this because of Emma's treatment." Her voice carried the familiar tone of someone who believed Marcus's achievements should take precedence over my medical needs, despite everything that had changed. Dad's response was firm, but measured. "Emma's treatment can't be rescheduled. It's part of a carefully timed protocol, and delays could affect her recovery. Marcus's science fair is important, but it's not life-threatening." The comparison was stark and undeniable, yet Mom seemed to struggle with accepting it. But this could affect his college applications, his future opportunities, she protested, as if my cancer was a lifestyle choice rather than a medical crisis. And missing treatment could affect whether Emma has a future at all, Dad replied quietly. The bluntness of his statement created a silence that filled the entire house. Marcus, who had been listening from the living room, appeared in the doorway looking upset and confused. "I don't want Emma to miss treatment because of my science fair," he said, his voice shaky. "That's not fair to her." It was a moment of clarity that came from the person we'd least expected to provide it. Marcus, at 15, understood what Mom was struggling to accept: that academic opportunities, however important, couldn't compete with medical necessities. His willingness to prioritize my health over his achievement was both touching and telling. It showed how much our family dynamics had shifted when even the person who'd been most privileged by our old priorities could see how wrong they were. "We'll figure out a way for you to participate," Dad assured Marcus. "Maybe we can arrange for you to present earlier in the day, or have someone else transport you to the event. But Emma's treatment comes first, and we all need to be clear about that." The plan they eventually worked out involved Margaret staying with me during the morning portion of my treatment while Dad and Mom attended Marcus's science fair presentation, then returning to the hospital for the afternoon session. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it represented something important: the recognition that my medical needs were non-negotiable, while other activities, however meaningful, could be adapted around them. Marcus won 3rd place at the regional competition, and when he called the hospital to tell me about his achievement, his first words were, "How are you feeling? Is the treatment going okay?" His priorities had shifted as dramatically as Dad's. As my treatment entered its final phases, the family support that had been so painfully absent during the early months became the foundation for everything else. Dad attended every session, armed with the expertise he'd developed through months of careful observation and Margaret's patient teaching. Mom gradually became more involved, taking over some of the home care responsibilities and learning to read the subtle signs that indicated how I was responding to each round of chemotherapy. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you needed," she said one evening, as she helped me with the anti-nausea routine that had become part of our post-treatment ritual. "I kept thinking that if you needed help, you'd ask for it directly. I didn't realize that asking for help when you're fighting cancer shouldn't be necessary. It should just be provided." Her apology felt genuine, and more importantly, it was backed up by changed behavior. She'd started keeping detailed notes about my symptoms and medication responses, coordinating with Margaret to ensure consistency in my care. And most significantly, she'd begun declining social commitments that conflicted with my recovery needs. When her book club wanted to meet at our house the day after my treatment, she suggested they meet elsewhere instead of expecting me to hide in my room while dealing with chemotherapy side effects. The most profound change was in how our family talked about my illness. For months, the dominant narrative had been that I was handling it well and didn't need to worry anyone. Now the conversation centered around what I was going through, what support I needed, and how everyone could contribute to my recovery. Marcus started researching nutrition for cancer patients and bringing me smoothie recipes he found online. Mom began reaching out to other families who'd dealt with cancer to learn about their support strategies. "I wish we'd done this from the beginning," Dad said during one of our regular check-ins with Dr. Peterson. We'd started having family meetings with my oncologist, where everyone could ask questions and understand their role in my care. "Emma's been incredibly strong, but she shouldn't have had to be strong alone." Dr. Peterson nodded approvingly. Family involvement makes an enormous difference in both treatment tolerance and long-term outcomes. The support system Emma has now is exactly what we hope to see for all our patients. Margaret continued to be part of my care team, but her role evolved as my family became more competent caregivers. Instead of providing primary support, she became a consultant and advocate, helping coordinate between home care and medical care, offering expertise when challenges arose, and ensuring that the quality of support remained consistently high. "This is how it's supposed to work," she told me during one of our regular coffee meetings outside the hospital. "Families learning to provide excellent care with professional guidance. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in when you did," I told her honestly. I was starting to think that being alone during treatment was normal, that I was asking too much by wanting someone there with me. Margaret shook her head firmly. "You were never asking too much. What you experienced was medical neglect, even if it wasn't intentional. Every patient deserves consistent, caring support during treatment." As my treatment neared completion, Dr. Peterson began talking about long-term recovery and monitoring. The intensity of chemotherapy would end, but I'd need regular checkups, continued attention to nutrition and exercise, and ongoing support as my body healed from months of intensive medical intervention. "Recovery from cancer treatment is a gradual process," she explained to our family during a planning meeting. "Emma will need several months to fully regain her strength and energy." "Whatever she needs," Dad said immediately. "We've learned what real support looks like, and we're committed to providing it throughout her recovery." His transformation from someone who'd missed most of my treatment to someone who was planning months ahead for my recovery needs was remarkable. More importantly, it felt genuine and sustainable rather than guilt-driven overcompensation. The day of my final chemotherapy session was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. Dad, Mom, Marcus, and Margaret were all there, along with Nurse Janet and several other medical staff who'd become part of my extended support network over the past months. As Janet removed my IV for the last time, there was a sense of celebration, mixed with exhaustion, hope tempered by the knowledge that recovery would take time. "You did it, Emma," Margaret said, squeezing my hand as we prepared to leave the infusion center that had been such a central part of my life for almost a year. "You got through the hardest part, and you did it with grace and courage." I looked around at the people who'd supported me through the most challenging experience of my life, realizing how dramatically different this moment was from what it would have been if I'd continued trying to handle everything alone. "We all did it," I replied, meaning every word. The victory belonged to everyone who'd shown up consistently, learned how to provide excellent care, and prioritized my health and recovery. It wasn't just my individual triumph. It was proof that families could learn to do better, that support systems could be built even when they'd been absent at the beginning. 3 months after my final treatment, I was asked to speak at a hospital fundraising event about the importance of family support during cancer treatment. Standing at the podium in front of hundreds of donors, medical professionals, and other families dealing with cancer, I shared my story, not just the medical journey, but the parallel journey of learning what support looked like and advocating for what I needed. For the first half of my treatment, I thought being strong meant handling everything independently, I told the audience. I thought needing support was a sign of weakness, and I tried to minimize my illness so my family wouldn't have to change their priorities. But cancer isn't something anyone should face alone, and strength isn't about suffering in silence. I talked about Margaret and the patient advocacy program, about how professional support had bridged the gap when family support wasn't available, and about how that professional care had taught my family what I actually needed. Sometimes families need to learn how to provide support during medical crises, I said. It's not always intuitive, especially when the illness is serious and frightening, but it's never too late to learn, and it's never too late to start doing better. The response to my speech was overwhelming. Families approached me afterward to share their own stories of struggling to provide adequate support during illness. Medical professionals talked about the challenges of helping families understand their loved ones' needs, and hospital administrators discussed expanding programs like the one that had connected me with Margaret. 6 months later, I received a call from Linda Rodriguez, the patient advocate who'd first connected me with support services. "Emma, I have something I want to discuss with you," she said, her voice containing barely suppressed excitement. "The Hospital board has approved funding for a new wing dedicated to comprehensive family support during extended treatment. They want to name it after you. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing would provide everything I'd needed during my cancer treatment. Volunteers for patients without adequate family support, education programs to help families learn caregiving skills, coordination services, to manage complex treatment schedules, and advocacy services for patients whose needs weren't being met. Your story showed us exactly what was missing in our current system, Linda explained. This wing will ensure that no patient has to go through intensive treatment without proper support. The dedication ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after my final chemotherapy session. The new wing was beautiful. Spacious rooms designed for long treatment sessions, comfortable areas for family members, educational spaces where caregivers could learn support skills, and coordination offices where patient advocates like Linda could help families navigate complex medical situations. My entire family was there, along with Margaret, Nurse Janet, Dr. Peterson, and dozens of other people who'd been part of my cancer journey. Marcus, now 16 and significantly more mature than the teenager who'd once complained about his birthday, party not being elaborate enough, gave a speech about what he'd learned about family priorities during serious illness. I used to think my activities and achievements were the most important things happening in our family, he said, standing confidently at the podium. But watching Emma fight cancer taught me that some things matter more than soccer games and science fairs. When someone you love is facing a life-threatening illness, everything else becomes secondary. Dad spoke about the learning process he'd gone through, from being an absent observer to becoming an engaged caregiver. I failed Emma during the early months of her treatment by assuming she didn't need support just because she didn't demand it, he said honestly. This wing exists to ensure that other families don't make the same mistakes I made, and that patients get the support they deserve from the beginning of their treatment rather than having to fight for it. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at an audience that included current cancer patients and their families, medical staff, hospital administrators, and community members who'd supported the fundraising effort. This wing represents everything I wished for during the loneliest moments of my treatment, I began. It's proof that individual experiences of struggle can create systemic change that helps other people. Cancer taught me that being strong doesn't mean suffering alone, I continued. It means advocating for what you need, accepting help when it's offered, and building support systems that sustain you through the hardest times. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing will ensure that future patients have access to excellent care and consistent support, regardless of their family situation. As I cut the ribbon to officially open the wing, surrounded by people who'd learned along with me what real support looked like, I felt a profound sense of completion. My cancer journey had begun with isolation and neglect, but it had transformed into a story about the power of advocacy, the importance of consistent care, and the possibility of families learning to do better. The wing's first patient was a 17-year-old named Sarah, who'd been diagnosed with leukemia while her parents were going through a difficult divorce. Neither parent felt able to provide consistent support during treatment, and Sarah had been facing the prospect of going through chemotherapy essentially alone. Instead, she was connected with a trained volunteer. Her parents received education about what support during cancer treatment should look like, and the family was given coordination services to help manage the complex logistics of intensive medical care. This is exactly why we built this wing, I told Sarah during a visit to see the new facilities in action. No one should have to figure out cancer support alone, and no family should have to learn through trial and error what their loved one needs. Watching Sarah receive the kind of comprehensive support I'd eventually found gave me immense satisfaction and confirmed that my difficult experience had contributed to something meaningful and lasting. 3 years later, I'm healthy, cancer-free, and working as a patient advocate myself, helping other young adults navigate serious illness with family, support challenges, The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing has served hundreds of patients, and the program model has been replicated at hospitals across the region. My family remains close and supportive, having learned through crisis how to prioritize what truly matters. Marcus is in college now, studying social work with a focus on family crisis intervention. Emma's cancer taught me what I want to do with my life, he told me during a recent visit home. I want to help families learn how to support each other during the worst times, so fewer people have to go through what you went through. His career choice feels like the final piece of transformation that began during those difficult months. When our family learned what love in action actually looked like, Mom and Dad have become volunteers with the hospital's family education program, sharing their story with other parents who are struggling to understand their role during a child's serious illness. We made mistakes, Dad tells these families. Honestly, but it's never too late to learn how to do better. The most important thing is showing up consistently and making your loved one's health and recovery the top priority. The experience of fighting cancer while advocating for family support taught me that personal struggles can become sources of systemic change when we're willing to speak honestly about what went wrong and work actively to create better solutions. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing stands as proof that individual pain can be transformed into collective healing, and that even the most difficult experiences can contribute to making the world a little bit better for the people who come after us. 5 years after my final chemotherapy session, I stood in the conference room of Memorial Hospital wearing a navy blazer and holding a folder thick with research, testimonials, and policy recommendations. The monthly board meeting was about to begin, and I was there not as a former patient, but as the newly appointed Director of Family Advocacy Services. The irony wasn't lost on me that the girl who'd once been abandoned during treatment was now responsible for ensuring no patient ever experienced what I had endured. Ms. Harrison, we're ready for your presentation, announced Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief medical officer, gesturing toward the head of the conference table. Around the room sat 12 board members, department heads, and senior administrators, all focused on the quarterly report I was about to deliver. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing had been operational for 3 years, and today I would present data that would either secure its permanent funding or force us to scale back services. Good morning, everyone, I began, projecting confidence. I'd learned to embody even when facing rooms full of powerful people who held other people's futures in their hands. Today I'm presenting outcomes data from the Family Support Wing, along with proposals for expansion that could fundamentally change how we approach patient care at Memorial Hospital. I clicked to my first slide, which showed a stark comparison between patient satisfaction scores before and after the wing's implementation. Patient satisfaction during extended treatment has increased by 47% since we began providing comprehensive family support services, I continued, watching faces around the room register surprise at the magnitude of the improvement. More significantly, treatment completion rates have improved by 32%, and post-treatment depression scores have decreased by 55%. These aren't just statistics. They represent real people who received better care because they weren't facing medical crises alone. Board member Richard Cole, a businessman who'd always been skeptical of programs he considered soft services, leaned forward in his chair. Those are impressive numbers, Emma, but what's the cost-benefit analysis? Are we seeing decreased readmission rates that offset the expense of these support services? His question was fair, but revealed the fundamental challenge of quantifying the value of human compassion within a healthcare system driven by financial constraints. Actually, yes, I replied, clicking to a slide that made several board members sit up straighter. Readmission rates for patients who used family support services are 28% lower than our baseline. Emergency department visits during treatment have decreased by 34%. When patients have consistent support, they manage side effects better, follow medication protocols more reliably, and seek appropriate help before reaching crisis points. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. Those are exactly the kinds of outcomes we hope to see. Patients with strong Support systems require less intensive intervention because problems are caught and addressed early. She turned to address the full board. What Emma's program has demonstrated is that investing in family support actually reduces overall treatment costs while dramatically improving patient experiences. I advanced to my next section, which contained stories and testimonials from patients who'd used the family support services. "I want you to meet Jessica Chen," I said, displaying a photo of a smiling teenager with a colorful headscarf. Jessica was 17 when diagnosed with brain cancer, while her single mother was working 3 jobs to support their family. Her mother couldn't take time off for 8-hour treatment sessions without losing income they desperately needed. Through our volunteer companion program, Jessica received consistent support during every treatment session. Our family education services taught her mother how to provide optimal home care during recovery periods. Our coordination services helped manage appointments around her mother's work schedule. I paused, letting the practical details sink in. Jessica completed treatment successfully, maintained strong family relationships, and is now studying pre-med at the State University. Without support services, she likely would have faced treatment alone and struggled with much worse outcomes. Board member Susan Martinez, a nurse before moving into hospital administration, raised her hand. "Emma, can you speak to the volunteer recruitment and training process? How do we ensure consistent quality when we're relying on unpaid staff?" Her question addressed one of the most challenging aspects of running a volunteer-based support program: maintaining high standards while depending on people who weren't financially invested in their performance. "Our volunteer training program is extensive and ongoing," I explained, clicking to a slide showing our curriculum structure. Initial training involves 40 hours of education about cancer treatment, family dynamics during medical crises, communication skills, and crisis management. Volunteers must commit to at least 6 months of service and participate in monthly continuing education sessions. I looked around the room. We also provide regular supervision and support for volunteers, recognizing that this work can be emotionally challenging. Most importantly, I continued, we carefully match volunteers with patients based on personality, communication style, and specific needs. A teenager with leukemia gets paired with someone different than an elderly patient with lung cancer. We've learned that one-size-fits-all support doesn't work. People need advocates who understand their specific situation and can provide appropriately tailored assistance. The presentation continued with detailed financial projections, expansion, proposals, and policy recommendations that would integrate family support services into standard treatment protocols rather than offering them as optional add-ons. What I'm proposing today represents a fundamental shift in how we think about cancer care, I said as I reached my concluding slides. Instead of treating family support as a luxury service for patients who happen to need it, we would make it a standard component of comprehensive cancer treatment. Every newly diagnosed patient would be assessed for family support adequacy, just like we assess their financial resources and transportation needs, I explained. Patients with insufficient support would automatically be connected with appropriate services rather than having to advocate for themselves during medical crises. We would proactively address support gaps instead of waiting for patients to struggle and then trying to intervene. Board Chair. Dr. Robert Jang leaned back in his chair, studying the data I'd presented. "Emma, this is compelling work, but I have to ask the difficult question. How do we scale this approach without dramatically increasing operational costs? What you're describing sounds like providing intensive social services to every cancer patient, which could be financially unsustainable." I had anticipated this challenge and had spent months developing responses that balanced idealism with pragmatic resource management. "The key is early intervention and graduated support," I replied. "Patients with strong family support require minimal services, maybe just educational resources and check-ins. Patients with moderate support gaps might need volunteer companions for some treatments but not comprehensive services. Only patients with significant support deficits require intensive intervention. Think of it like triage, I continued, using a medical analogy the board would understand. We assess need and provide appropriate levels of support rather than giving everyone the same intensive services. Most patients need relatively little additional support, but identifying and helping the patients who need extensive services prevents much more expensive complications down the line. Dr. Williams interjected with information that strengthened my argument. Emma's approach aligns with evidence-based practices in other medical specialties. We've seen similar models work effectively in cardiac rehabilitation, diabetes management, and post-surgical recovery. Graduated support based on assessed need is both clinically sound and financially sustainable. The discussion that followed involved detailed questions about implementation timelines, staff training requirements, and integration with existing hospital services. Board members who'd initially seemed skeptical began asking practical questions about how to operationalize the expansion, rather than whether it should be approved. I could sense the conversation shifting from evaluation to planning, which felt like a significant victory. "One more question, Emma," said board member Jennifer Liu, who managed community relations for a large corporation. "How do we measure success beyond the clinical outcomes you've presented? How do we know if we're truly making a difference in people's lives, rather than just checking boxes on satisfaction surveys?" The question touched on something I felt passionate about: the difference between procedural compliance and meaningful impact. "We track long-term outcomes," I replied. "Not just treatment completion and immediate satisfaction, but quality of life measures 6 months and 1 year post-treatment. We follow up with families to understand how the support they received affected their overall experience and recovery process. More importantly," I continued, "we listen to stories. Every quarter, I interview patients and families about their experience with our services. They tell us what worked, what didn't, and what they still needed that we didn't provide. Those conversations guide our program improvements and help us understand the human impact of what we do." I shared some of those stories with the board. Marcus Thompson, whose elderly parents learned to advocate for him during lymphoma treatment, despite having no previous experience with serious illness. Sarah Williams, whose divorced parents put aside their conflicts to coordinate her leukemia care after receiving family mediation services. David Martinez, whose rural family learned to manage complex medication schedules and nutrition requirements through our telehealth education program. These families didn't just receive support during treatment, I explained. They learned skills that will serve them for the rest of their lives. They understand how to navigate medical systems, how to communicate with healthcare providers, how to coordinate care during emergencies. They became more competent advocates for their own health and their family members' health. Board member Cole, who'd seemed most concerned about costs, surprised me with his next comment. "Emma, what you're describing sounds like we're not just treating cancer. We're educating families to be better healthcare consumers long term. That could have benefits far beyond oncology services." His recognition that family support services created broader community health benefits was exactly the kind of systems thinking I'd hoped to encourage. "Exactly," I replied enthusiastically. Families who learn to provide excellent support during cancer treatment apply those skills to other medical situations. They become more engaged in preventive care, better at managing chronic conditions, and more effective advocates when other health issues arise. We're building community capacity for health management, not just treating individual cases of cancer. The board voted unanimously to approve permanent funding for the Family Support Wing and authorized planning for the expanded services I'd proposed. As members filed out of the conference room, several stopped to congratulate me on the presentation and express enthusiasm for the program's growth. Dr. Williams lingered after the others had left, clearly wanting to have a private conversation. "Emma, that was exceptional work," she said, gathering her materials slowly. You've built something remarkable here, and today's presentation demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need in healthcare administration." She paused, as if considering her next words carefully. "I have a proposition I'd like you to consider." Over coffee in her office, Dr. Williams outlined an opportunity that would represent another major transition in my career trajectory. The Regional Medical Consortium was looking for someone to develop family support protocols across multiple hospitals, creating standardized approaches that could be implemented throughout the healthcare system. They want someone with your background, clinical experience as a patient, program development expertise, and proven ability to translate individual stories into systemic change. The position would involve significant travel, working with diverse hospital systems, and developing training programs that could be scaled across hundreds of facilities, she explained. "It's a chance to take what you've built here and help create similar programs everywhere, ensuring that patients across the region have access to excellent family support during medical crises." The opportunity was both exciting and daunting. Leaving Memorial Hospital would mean stepping away from the program I'd built and the community that had supported my own recovery and growth. But it also represented the chance to ensure that thousands of patients received the kind of support that had transformed my own treatment experience from isolation to empowerment. "I need some time to think about it," I told Dr. Williams, though part of me was already imagining the impact of implementing family support services across dozens of hospitals. "This has been my home for 5 years, and the work here feels personal in ways that make it hard to consider leaving." "Take all the time you need," she replied kindly. "But remember that sometimes the best way to honor what a place has given you is to take those gifts and share them with people who need them elsewhere. You've proven that excellent family support during cancer treatment is possible. Now you have the chance to make it standard practice instead of exceptional service." That evening, I drove to the quiet park where I'd often walked during my recovery, thinking through the decision that lay ahead. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing had exceeded every goal we'd set, but more importantly, it had become a model that other hospitals were already trying to replicate. The testimonials, data, and stories I'd presented to the board represented not just successful programs, but proof that healthcare systems could prioritize human connection alongside medical intervention. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, who was now in his final year of social work school and planning to specialize in medical family therapy. "Heard about your board presentation today. Dad said you knocked it out of the park. So proud of everything you've built." His message was followed by one from Mom. "Watching you turn your hardest experience into something that helps so many other families fills my heart. You've taught us all what resilience looks like." These messages from my family, people who'd learned alongside me what support during medical crises actually meant, reminded me that the work I was doing extended far beyond professional achievement. Every family who learned to provide excellent care during illness, every patient who received consistent support during treatment, every volunteer who discovered the satisfaction of making someone's worst days more bearable, they were all part of a ripple effect that had started with my own struggle to get adequate support during cancer treatment. 2 weeks later, I accepted the regional position, but with conditions that would allow me to maintain connection to Memorial Hospital and continue mentoring the staff who would take over direct operation of the Family Support Wing. My new role would involve developing implementation guides, training program directors, evaluating outcomes across multiple sites, and advocating for policy changes that would make family support services a standard component of cancer care rather than an innovative add-on. The farewell celebration at Memorial Hospital was overwhelming in the best possible way. Patients I'd worked with, families who'd received services, volunteers who'd become close friends, and medical staff who'd supported the program's development, all gathered to acknowledge the transition and celebrate what we'd accomplished together. Margaret, my original volunteer companion, gave a speech that brought everyone to tears. 5 years ago, Emma was a patient who needed support and wasn't getting it from the people who should have provided it, she said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Today, she's a leader who ensures that other patients get the support they deserve from the moment they're diagnosed. She took her own pain and transformed it into a system that prevents other people from experiencing what she went through. Dr. Peterson, my former oncologist, spoke about the medical benefits of the family support services and their impact on treatment outcomes. Emma's program has demonstrated conclusively that excellent family support isn't just nice to have, it's medically necessary for optimal cancer treatment. Patients with strong support systems have better treatment tolerance, fewer complications, and superior long-term outcomes. What started as compassionate care has proven to be evidence-based medical practice. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at faces that represented every stage of my journey from isolated patient to healthcare advocate. This work exists because all of you believed that patients deserve better than what I initially received, I began. You believed that families could learn to provide excellent support, that healthcare systems could prioritize human connection, and that individual experiences of struggle could be transformed into collective solutions. The Emma Harrison Family Support Wing isn't really named after me, I continued. It's named after every patient who's ever felt alone during medical treatment, every family who's ever struggled to provide adequate support during crisis, and every healthcare provider who's ever wished they could do more to help people through the hardest times of their lives. I talked about the letters I received from patients across the country who'd heard about our program and wished similar services existed in their communities. I shared stories about hospital administrators who were implementing support services based on our model, and about families who'd contacted me to express gratitude for programs that had made their cancer experiences more manageable. In my new role, I'll be working to ensure that excellent family support during cancer treatment becomes standard practice rather than exceptional service, I announced. Every patient deserves to have someone there during 8-hour chemotherapy sessions. Every family deserves education about how to provide optimal home care during recovery. Every person facing cancer deserves to feel supported, valued, and cared for throughout their treatment journey. The applause that followed felt like a sending off and a commissioning combined, acknowledgement of what had been accomplished, and anticipation of what lay ahead. As people approached afterward to share personal stories about how the family support services had affected their lives, I was reminded again that healthcare isn't just about medical procedures and clinical outcomes. It's about ensuring that people feel seen, supported, and valued during the most vulnerable times of their lives. 6 months into my regional role, I've helped implement family support services at 8 hospitals, trained over 200 staff members and volunteers, and developed assessment protocols that ensure patients with support gaps are identified and helped quickly. The data continues to demonstrate that excellent family support improves both clinical outcomes and patient satisfaction while reducing overall treatment costs. More importantly, I receive regular updates about individual patients whose experiences have been transformed by having consistent support during treatment. Last week, I heard from a mother whose teenage son completed leukemia treatment with volunteer support after his father was deployed overseas. This month, I received a thank you note from an elderly woman whose daughter learned to coordinate her cancer care despite living in another state. Each of these stories represents validation that the work we're doing addresses real needs and creates meaningful change in people's lives. They remind me that behind every policy recommendation and program implementation are individuals who are fighting for their lives while navigating complex healthcare systems, often without adequate support from the people who should be providing it. My own family continues to be involved in the work, though their roles have evolved as the programs have grown. Dad serves on the advisory board for the Regional Family Support Initiative, bringing his business expertise to sustainability, planning and expansion strategies. Mom volunteers with new family education programs, sharing her experience of learning to provide excellent care during crisis. Marcus is completing his master's thesis on family dynamics during medical treatment, planning to become a therapist who helps families navigate healthcare crises. "We learned something important from your cancer experience," Dad told me during a recent family dinner. "We learned that love isn't just feeling care for someone, it's acting on that care consistently, especially when they need it most. The work you're doing now helps other families learn that lesson without having to fail first like we did. The transformation in our family relationships has been as profound as any professional achievement. We've become people who show up for each other during difficult times, who prioritize health and well-being over convenience and social obligations, and who understand that support during crisis is a fundamental expression of love rather than an optional gesture. As I prepare to present outcomes data to the Regional Medical Consortium next month, advocating for expanded funding that would bring family support services to dozens more hospitals, I'm struck by the distance traveled from that isolated teenager receiving chemotherapy alone to this advocate working to ensure no patient faces treatment without adequate support. The presentation will include statistics about improved treatment outcomes, reduced healthcare costs, and enhanced patient satisfaction. But it will also include stories about individual transformation, patients who felt valued and supported during the scariest times of their lives, families who learned to provide excellent care during medical crises, and healthcare systems that prioritized human connection alongside clinical excellence. The work continues to expand because the need is universal. Every day, people receive cancer diagnoses that will require intensive treatment, ongoing support, and family involvement in complex care coordination. Some of those people have strong support systems that will adapt to meet new challenges. Others, like I was, will face the prospect of managing serious illness essentially alone unless healthcare systems provide what families cannot or will not offer. My goal is to make excellent family support during cancer treatment so standard, so expected, that no patient ever has to advocate for basic companionship during chemotherapy or education about home care during recovery. I want family support services to be as routine as prescription medications or follow-up appointments. Automatic components of comprehensive cancer care rather than special programs for patients who happen to need extra help. That vision drives everything I do now, from policy development to staff training to program evaluation. Every meeting, every presentation, every conversation with healthcare administrators is an opportunity to advance the idea that patients deserve better than what I initially received, and that healthcare systems have the capacity to provide it when they commit to prioritizing human needs alongside medical intervention. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your bath screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.